All right, let's talk about something that's on a lot of people's minds. Why does it feel so incredibly hard to buy a house these days? Way harder than it seemed to be for our parents' generation. Well, we're going to dig into the numbers, breaking down a report from the Resolution Foundation that really lays out the massive shift between generations.
I want to start with just one number. That's it. One number that tells a huge part of this story, and that number is 19.
19 is the number of years it now takes a typical young family to save up for a deposit on their first home. Now, compare that to a generation ago. Back then, when baby boomers had, get this, 86% more purchasing power, it took about 3 years. We've gone from 3 years to 19. That's not just a small jump, it's a marathon just to get to the starting.
So the big question is, how on earth did this 19-year wait become a reality? And what does it actually mean for an entire generation's future?
Well, the impact of that long wait is pretty staggering. It means we're seeing a huge drop in home ownership among young people. At an age where most boomers were already in their own homes, today's 30-year-olds are only half as likely to be. This has completely changed the landscape of how young people live. It's pushed millions into renting for the long haul, creating what a lot of people are now calling generation rent. And you can see that change so clearly right here. Look at the data for 30-year-olds. For baby boomers, nearly 60% own their home. For millennials, that number has been sliced in half, down to just 30%. So if they aren't buying, where are they living? This chart tells you everything. The number of 30-year-olds in private rentals has literally quadrupled. It's gone from just 1 in 10 for boomers all the way up to 4 in 10 for millennials.
But this whole thing isn't just about owning versus renting. It's about something much more fundamental. How much of your hard-earned money is just gone on housing, no matter what your situation is. Let's look at the breakdown. At age 30, baby boomers were spending, on average, around 17% of their income on housing, a pretty decent chunk, but for most, it was manageable.
Now, let's jump to a millennial at that same age. That slice of the pie has ballooned to 23%. And that difference might not sound huge, but it's a massive squeeze that leaves way less room for savings, for investing, or, just living your life.
And here's where it gets even more frustrating. You'd think that paying more for housing would mean you're at least getting something better for your money. But actually, the data shows you're often getting less. The report itself just nails it with this quote. The squeeze isn't just financial, it's a literal one affecting your time and your physical space. So what does that look like in the real world? Well, to find housing they can afford, young people are being pushed further and further out. That means longer commutes. We're talking about an extra 64 hours a year spent traveling for a 40-year-old millennial compared to a boomer at that same age. That's almost 3 full days of your life gone.
And it's not just about your time, it's also about your actual space. The report found that millennials are way more likely to be living in overcrowded conditions than even the generation right before them, Gen X. So you're paying more money for less space.
So what happens next? Is this just how things are now? Well, the report doesn't give us one simple answer. Instead, it lays out 2 very different possibilities for where generation rent could be headed.
Okay, so let's start with the optimistic scenario. In this version, millennial homeownership does start to recover. It might even catch up to Gen X. But, and this is a big but, it would still be way behind the boomers. And because they're starting so much later, they'll be paying off mortgages deep into their lives, which has a huge impact on retirement.
Now, the pessimistic scenario, that's a much darker picture. In this future, less than half of millennials own a home by the time they're 45. Renting becomes the norm for the majority. Think about that, especially when you consider that the boomer generation currently holds over $85 trillion in wealth, so much of it tied to property. Homeownership could become something for the few, not the many.
So when you step back and you look at all this data, the 19-year wait, the higher costs, the smaller spaces, it paints a really tough picture. The path to the kind of housing security that previous generations had just seems to be getting narrower and narrower. And that leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question. For a whole generation that's looking at a 19-year climb just to get a down payment, you have to ask, is the ladder simply being pulled up?